100% yes. I've actually touched on it in my first book, and I might write a book just on the comparisons between these two and their insane genocidal regimes. Tankies and Soviet worshippers are not going to like this one, but you might ask yourself, why do you think it's okay to worship one genocidal colonial maniac, and that is what they were, genocidal and colonial, and not the other? Simply because they're supposedly opposites? They're not. The Soviet Union never achieved true communism. Marx and Lenin are rolling over in their graves. Fascism, such as Nazism, shared more in common with Soviet communism than you would like to admit. And their leaders both said that they would be great friends and they might be able to take over the entirety of Europe and Asia if they could just work together. They wanted to work together. Well, Mustache didn't because he betrayed Stalin, but if they would have been best buddies. There's this thing called the horseshoe theory. The further you go to the left, you just end up on the right, because extreme leftism is closer to extreme rightism than you want to admit when there's a genocidal authoritarian dictator in charge. That's why there's this phenomenon of the alt-left extreme hippie people falling down the QAnon conspiracy theorist pipeline. This is for educational purposes, TikTok. To summarize, both were colonizing empires that carried out mass murder, ethnic cleansing, and genocides. Both were anti-democratic, operated under a one-party system, and solved political disputes by purging hundreds of thousands of their rivals and imprisoning them in labor camps if they didn't just kill them outright. In each empire, there was a system of camps for political prisoners and people whom they considered undesirable. Both were highly nationalistic and held rallies to express their pride in their evil campaigns. They each had a hierarchy of power, with one man at the top and the next most powerful man as the head of the secret police. And both used many paid informants who weren't necessarily part of the secret police. In order to completely brainwash the youth, they began with indoctrination in school and the official youth organizations, the Mustache Youth in Germany and the Pioneers in the USSR, and both taught their children to report and denounce their family if they spoke ill about the government. Within these countries, they invaded to create their empires. They installed puppet governments in order to control the country. They each had a manifesto that they held in high esteem. They both burned books of which they didn't approve. They both promoted the most elaborate propaganda and suppressed freedom of speech and freedom of press, unless it supported the narrative they wished to push. Each regime targeted and murdered journalists, writers, and intellectuals. The Soviets actually created the mobile gas units, and they started relocating millions of peasants in the 1930s via cattle car before the people who could not see even began doing that. By some estimates, they had deported or displaced upwards of 10 million people before 1939, mostly via train. And finally, both the regimes were largely anti-Semitic and sought to displace and kill Jewish people. Just like the regimes themselves, the infamous leaders had more in common than not. Mustache betrayed a pact with Stalin. I went over that earlier, but if they didn't, they would have been great friends. Just like Mustache, Stalin was also pathologically and physically unwell. They were both severely paranoid, sadists, previously imprisoned criminals, anti-Semites, and both suffered from a plethora of physical impairments and diseases, some of which are quite funny. I won't go over their impairments and physical diseases in this because it's quite long, but if you would like to know, let me know. They were anti-Semitic, but they still did use a few Jewish people in their regime if they could serve the regime loyally. And as we all know, being abandoned by your father and abused as a child does not create a well-rounded person, and they were both abandoned and abused. A lot of the benefits that people point to in communism, I actually agree with. What Marx and Lenin actually wanted communism to look like sound good on paper. Even I agree on that. But what it played out as in the Soviet Union and every other country that adopted communism, because pretty much all of them that did conducted a genocide of their own, all of that, Marx and Lenin are rolling the fuck over. Everyone is supposed to be equal at the bottom. That leaves room for the oligarchs to control power and wealth. A brief list of the genocides and ethnic cleansings committed under Stalin between 1924 and 1953. At least 14 million people were sent to a gulag, a forced labor camp, and they say that only 1 million people died in those camps, but that's fucking false. We are still uncovering mass graves. There was the Polish operation of the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB. In 1 year, they killed up to 250,000 Polish people. On March 5th of 1940, in Poland, the Katyn massacre, in which 22,000 people were killed in a day. Process of dekulakization, which means just getting rid of the kulaks, which were wealthy peasants. Wealthy as in they could own like 8 hectares of land, they could have 2 cattle, and maybe hire a farmhand. They were wealthy, and the Soviets took over their farms and deported them in countries that the USSR colonized, because that's what it fucking was. Up to 15 million Soviet, Eastern European, and Central Asian kulaks, and ethnic minorities as well, were deported to forced relocation settlements in Siberia. Many millions died during the deportation process and then at the camps. It was the Soviet famine of 1930 to 1933 in USSR countries, a man-made famine that killed 5.7 to 7 million people, primarily in the Ukraine, where 3 to 5 million of them died. The famine is called the Holodomor in the Ukraine. And then there was the Soviet famine of 1946 to 1947, another forced famine in which 1 to 1.5 million people died, primarily in the Caucasus region, where they produced grain. And during the famine years, the Soviet Union were exporting millions of tons of grain. They produced the wheat, processed it, and then shipped it out and let their people starve to death. That's a fucking genocide. The ethnic cleansings of the minorities, the non-USSR countries that the Soviets occupied, at least 5.8 million minorities were forcibly relocated to settlements in the USSR. Deportation of Chechens and Ingush people from 1944 to 48, which up to 400,000 of them were killed. Deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944, in which up to 195,000 were killed. Plethora of war crimes committed between 1917 and 1991 in the USSR countries, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Moldova, Latvia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Turkmenistan, and Estonia, and the countries that they occupied or invaded but weren't incorporated as part of the USSR, you know, the colonies that they had: Afghanistan, China, Mongolia, Japan, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and Albania. Tell me again how those leaders and their regimes are not similar. I'll leave you with one thing though. My favorite similarity between those two men is that they both sometimes shit their pants.